I personally can't think of anything better to do than to find a good book, a comfortable space, and read.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for people whose bookshelves are bursting with good intentions. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. And Michaela, what are you reading?
Well, I have just finished The Vegetarian by South Korean writer Han Kang, and it was translated by Deborah Smith. It won the International Booker Prize for Fiction in 2016, so I'm a little late to come to the party. But she also won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2024. So this has all eluded me, and I've only discovered her recently. And wow, I mean, this book is one of the best and one of the strangest experiences I've had reading in a very long time. It's so original. I have to say, it doesn't really sell South Korea to me. It really seems to come from a place which is just, showing the patriarchal and the hierarchical sort of nature of South Korean society. So it's about a very quiet woman who decides to become vegetarian, and from there, everything just seems to unravel. And her husband and her father and even she just struggle incredibly with this decision of hers.
Well, I'm really embarrassed to say that I gave The Vegetarian away, and not particularly somebody who I was recommending it to, someone who grabbed it from me because it won the Booker Prize, but I couldn't deal with it. It was a dark, dark book, I felt.
It is a dark book, but I think if you are in the right place, it's so good, it's worth having a second. Have a second go at it sometime. When you're just feeling really well rested and feeling curious, give it a go. Because I've never gotten into anything, I'm not into the pop culture of South Korea or the movies or the TV series. I'm pretty new to the whole area, and it was a real eye-opener for me. It took me somewhere different.
Well, since then I've read Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, which is set in Korea as well, and it's an amazing saga which really makes you understand the whole relationship between Japan and Korea. Yeah. And that a little lighter, a little easier to read, dark in its way.
But I mean,
yes, we're looking at it here on the table.
The Vegetarian's not a long story, but Pachinko looks as if it is. Yeah.
But it just makes you realise you have to persevere. Yeah. Because you don't want to end up like with AI summarising books for us.
We've got to get our attention spans beyond that 10 seconds of Twitter, haven't we? Anyway.
Now, who have you been talking to?
Okay, so I'm bringing Heather Rose back to Sundoku. Sarah interviewed her back in January 2023. I don't know where the time goes. You can find Sarah's interview. It was 18.5, and I think we're up to 58. So 40 episodes ago, Sarah met her and loved Heather. She was talking to her about her autobiography, Nothing Bad Ever Happens Here. Well, Heather has jumped genres again, as she's wont to do, and she's produced her first work of historical fiction, which is called A Great Act of Love. And Sarah did say I was going to love her, and it turns out she was right. We both love a cup of rooibos tea, so we sat down in my living room and had a bit of a chat. And as I was setting up the equipment, we were chatting away, and I told her how much I loved the character Quill in A Great Act of Love. And she shared this interesting little insight into how she creates her characters.
He was just called Quill when he arrived, and I was like, that's a weird name to have. But then when the captain said writing his own life, I thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
That's his name.
But yeah.
I love how your characters are talking to you.
Yeah, they do.
That's fascinating.
They do. My daughter says I probably shouldn't talk about it, really, the way I do. But, it's a really productive form of madness.
Yep, so it seems Heather's characters often just arrive in her mind, named, and then they get to know each other as she writes. Anyway, more from the very warm and very friendly Heather Rose in a moment. But can we have an insight into who you've been speaking to, Annie?
Well, you may be interested in this as a former publisher or someone involved in the publishing world, because I'm talking to a person who has started her own publishing company.
Oh, lovely.
How do you do that? Oh. What a brave thing to do, to dive into.
I've always said you need the head of an accountant and the heart of an artist to be a publisher. So
they don't go together very well, do they? Anyway, we're talking to Emily Richards about Aniko Press. Well, actually, they've only produced one book, which is interesting. I mean, that is part of the story of the struggle to be an independent publisher. But that book is great. We talked to Miriam Webster a few weeks ago about her book, The Slip, and this is how I ended up talking to Emily.
Heather Rose's readers have come to expect the unexpected from her. I've read 3 of her books and I enjoyed them all in their own way. First, it was The Contemporary Art World of the Museum of Modern Love. I think you enjoyed that one, Annie, didn't you?
One of the best books I've ever read.
Yeah, she's clever, isn't she? Yeah. Then there was the political thriller Bruni, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And now she's written a huge historical saga called A Great Act of Love. Now, some of the characters in the book are actual historical figures, such as Bartholomew Broughton, who made Van Diemen's Land's first wine. And there's Captain Swanston. He features quite a bit. He was in real life the managing director of the Derwent Bank. But the main protagonist, Caroline Colbert, or as she becomes known when she makes her way to Van Diemen's Land, Caroline Douglas, she appears to be a character of fiction. So I asked Heather, who is Caroline and what's her story?
Dear Caroline, she arrives in Van Diemen's Land as a young widow in the 1830s, and she comes with an interesting story, which was also told to me as a child. My mum told us that we were descended from French nobility that had been beheaded in the French Revolution, and their son had escaped to Britain. He had settled in London, and his daughter had travelled to Van Diemen's Land as a young widow because apparently her husband had fallen over Niagara Falls on their honeymoon.
Oh, so much of this I hear already in the book, yes.
That's right. And so I was told that when I was very young, of course, and even at the time I thought that's a very curious story. It is true that people travelled to Niagara Falls in that period. It was a bit like taking a wagon from Hobart to Cradle Mountain, and it was a wild, intrepid kind of journey. But people did it, and having now been to Niagara Falls, I realised how easy it would be to fall over, especially before they had the railings and security measures they have now, because the water itself is so compelling. But for what it's worth, in the book, Caroline arrives with this story of a husband who's died falling over Niagara Falls. And the reason she does that is she needs the mantle of a widow to give herself some authority and some sense of independence in a world that isn't designed for women on their own.
Yeah, I think there's a line in the book where you say that the women in Van Diemen's Land were either mothers or harlots or something like that. They really didn't have any other roles.
That's right, unless you were a young woman expecting marriage, looking for marriage, you were a married woman, or you were a widow of the ancient crone-like variety, then there was no place for you in society. It wasn't okay to simply be a capable, young, independent and single woman.
And so what's the story of Caroline in A Great Act of Love?
Well, Caroline is born to really beautiful parents. Hannah, her mother, has a father who's an apothecarist and a chemist, and he trains the man who will become her husband, Jacques Louis, and together they move to London to have a bigger life from Edinburgh, and they establish an apothecary and chemist in Georgian England. And Jacques Louis becomes well known not only for his skill as an apothecary and chemist to the medical profession, because his knowledge of herbs and plants and healing treatments is very well respected, but he's beloved by the community because it's the age of the Industrial Revolution, and so there are so many people coming in from the country having lost their livelihoods because of the industrialisation of their labours. They seek work in the factories. The factory life is bitter and grim and very, very dangerous. And of course, there are injuries and wounds, and Jacques Louis takes them into his care. And so he's beloved in the community, and they have 3 daughters. Caroline is the oldest, and he trains Caroline to also be an apothecary and a chemist because he believes there's a bigger life for her. And he really sees the possibilities of a woman in medicine. And they have an extraordinary greenhouse at the back of the house, and they go foraging for herbs up the Thames. And he teaches Caroline so much about the world, but also about the philosophies of the world, because he is the son of French nobility, and he's come to London as an émigré because of the French Revolution and the loss of his parents to the guillotine. And then he falls from a roof and has a dreadful head injury and becomes a very mercurial person that his family love and adore and care for, but cannot control his moods or his emotions. And of course, very little in that time was known about frontal lobe disorder and the effect of brain trauma. So he becomes a different person, and yet Caroline can't let him go. And then he commits a truly horrific crime on the Battersea Bridge, which is how the book opens. And she finds that she has to reinvent herself in a new life far away because the stain of his crime will never leave their family.
And that really is where the book takes off, and so much happens to Caroline from that point onwards. The storytelling is very rich, and you've touched on philosophy. I think the book, it's more than decorated with it. This book is imbued with the work of great thinkers and great writers. There's, Coleridge and Wordsworth and the Stoics and Robbie Burns, all sorts. Did you enjoy reading the works of those who were current at the time? Because you've used them quite liberally throughout the book.
It was the most extraordinary privilege to do the research for this book. It took me 7 years, and some people came into my studio, which is away from the house, and I have no Wi-Fi or internet there, and they were looking at the little section that is just my research section for the current book that I'm working on. They said, "Oh, how many books are there? That seems like a lot of books to read." And I said, "Oh, I think there's about 50, I don't know." And later, after they'd left, I counted them and there were 161.
You're no mathematician, are you?
No. Well, it's hard to tell with books, you know that.
They can hide, they do.
They multiply quietly. And there are in that collection, there are books of colonial history, of course, the French Revolution, the philosophers, the Enlightenment, the American War of Independence, biographies of Leonardo da Vinci and Benjamin Franklin. I had to get the worldview. I had to understand why the French Revolution happened. And in order to do that, I needed to go back to the Enlightenment and so-called Enlightenment, and then understand the impact of the War of Independence on the French Revolution, and then the degree to which the British government suppressed the natural uprising that was starting to happen in London as a result of the French Revolution.
I had never thought of it in those terms until I read it in the book, where you explained it beautifully, why the revolution didn't happen, because they got rid of all the people who had a grievance against it.
That's right. And they were called convicts, which replaced the black slaves.
Yes.
Thank goodness the abolitionists had been successful, but they replaced that labour on plantations with white labour, and they were the convicts that settled Terra Australis, as it was called then, and they made the world of colonial Australia and certainly of colonial Van Diemen's Land. And of course there were also entrepreneurs that were engaged in that process of making a little England in Van Diemen's Land and of course in Sydney and elsewhere, but they all had convict servants.
Mm-hmm. That worldview that you've created at the time is one of the very special things about reading this book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm so grateful to you for all of that research. There is also much in the book that relates to the question of God and of nature. And the work of philosopher Spinoza is mentioned specifically a few times. You mentioned a number of people, but his name does come up 2 or 3 times. Can you tell us about this man, his philosophy, and how I think it's became central to this work?
One of the fascinating things I discovered in the research for this book, the character of Jacques Louis is based on my great-grandmother's father. And he actually translated a book about Hinduism from the French into English. And as a result of that, reading that and seeing his notes in the back, I was able to glimpse a man of extraordinary intellect and curiosity. And there are references throughout that to how nature is the governing force, that we are of nature to set ourselves apart as if we belong to a different God culture, and nature is simply our servant, our slave. the thing that allows us to eat and produce and to some extent create all the things that the Industrial Revolution created and continues to create, was a really curious observation for me at that time, because the church had been so dominant in repressing any other sort of ideology. I mean, poor old Galileo was treated so badly simply for knowing that the earth revolved around the sun, because again, that questioned the God impetus, the power of God, the force of religion. And in the 1700s, you start to see this rising up of atheism. But people need something to replace God if they're not going to have a God, especially when they've lived in a world where God has been so dominant, the idea of a God has been so dominant. And so Spinoza and others started to see that what they really lived in was the kingdom of nature. And that was very evident to me growing up as a child in Van Diemen's, in now Tasmania, and looking back into Van Diemen's Land and what it would have been like for Caroline to arrive there when it was literally a paradise that we had stolen from the native people and
from nature.
And were busy ruining it, ruining the rivers, ruining the landscape, destroying the forests, and we've gone on doing that for the last 200 and more years now. So to see the world through the lens of a young woman coming out of Georgian and early Victorian England, a world that's caked with coal dust and sewerage and seepage and horse dung everywhere, to a bright, shining world of extraordinary forests and beautiful grasslands, a place that had been kept as a garden for 60 and 80,000 years by the old people. And so she starts to consider, maybe this is the kingdom of nature.
I think there's a line in the book that I love, and there's many that relate to this sort of theme, but nature is the faithful administrator of a glorious enterprise.
Yes, maybe Jacques Louis, nature is the faithful administrator of a glorious enterprise.
Yeah.
Yes, and the other day I heard Robert Macfarlane's Is a River Alive?
Yep.
There's a beautiful young woman in that who refers to nature as a kingdom, because there's no need for a king or a queen. It's a K-I-N.
It's a brother or a sister, yeah.
That's right. It's our kin. That's right. And I think that's such a beautiful way to look at nature, to say it's our kingdom.
Absolutely. I really didn't know, as I finished it, whether to feel incredibly encouraged by this story or utterly depressed. But I guess what your book is showing is that it was damn tough in those days. And it can be again.
Well, I think I was startled to discover that many of the threads that are in the so-called Enlightenment and the birth of the Industrial Revolution, the births of so-called modern economics from Adam Smith onwards, it startled me how similar it was to now. That we are well into a technological revolution, and we are seeing the loss of jobs, and we're seeing the unrest that causes. We're seeing an enormous number of people moving around the world trying to find a better way of life for their families, because climate is making it almost impossible to live in many locations now. And that's only going to escalate in the next 100 and 200 years. And so it was disconcerting for me to realise, this is a version of then now. And it troubled me a great deal. I think that we're not awake to it, as I don't think we were really awake to it back then either. And we didn't see that convicts were white slaves, and we didn't see the brutality of the convict system. It shocked me to read the many, many reports and accounts that I read about the convict system to realise how appallingly the British government had treated the white slaves they called convicts. Not only were they sent out for nothing, for virtually nothing. I mean, let me say there were of course, as we well know, murderers and, very, very serious criminals. But there were so many that were just done for a duck.
Yeah. Young, 11, 12-year-olds, this sort of thing.
Just hungry, unhoused, unhomed, without any other prospect of feeding themselves or their family, young women having to prostitute themselves. Slavery everywhere, really. As there is now, but we just don't see it in the same way. I would argue that the Amazon workforce is very, very similar to the workforce that was put into factories in the Industrial Revolution. Very little regard for their well-being.
Do you read historical fiction? This is your first foray into that. So is that your go-to genre?
I am a very, very eclectic reader. I read everything from Rebecca Yaros, Fourth Wing, to Robert Galbraith crime series, to of course I went back to the Brontes, I went back to Victor Hugo, I went back to many of the other novels written in that time, Frankenstein and all of those, because I wanted to understand how they wrote back then again. So looking at it through the lens, not simply as a reader but as a writer. Dickens, although he's a little later, how did they construct their sentences? What's particular to that time about the way they tell a story? Because I wanted it to feel instantly like you were in 1836 or in 1839, but not be laboured by the pace of the novels of that time. They expect a lot of you now. I love them. I'm completely besotted by them all. But in the modern era, to see Hilary Mantel do what she did with Wolf Hall and that trilogy, extraordinary work.
And
the same with Maggie O'Farrell. I mean, she's my...
I wondered about that.
Yeah. I sat the marriage portrait on the desk for the last 2 years. That's the bar, Heather. You have to make it feel as authentic but as effortless. Yeah. So that we're with these characters without even noticing that we're back in the 17 or 1800s, and that the world is the world. I'm not trying to tell you anything. I'm not trying to show you how much research I've done. This is how they're experiencing the world.
Well, you don't mind a challenge. You'll go from the pace of crime and Bruni, and then you'll go to the Museum of Modern Life. These are the ones I've read, and then A Great Act of Love. They're all so different, and you nail it every time, which I can't get my head around how you can possibly do that. So, hats off to you.
Well, thank you, Michaela. It's a great challenge, and I didn't mean to do my career that way. It's just that they got pigeonholed in a certain way. So The Butterfly Man was apparently a crime novel, and I didn't know that when I was writing it. And, the books have gone on, but now I think, this is such a great way for me to maintain my own craft, because all that really matters to me is that I write a better and a better book every time. And I love that my readers come with me on that they're willing to keep exploring with me, and it's fantastic.
You certainly have my trust. Can you give us any hints about what's next for you? Are you going to stay in the past? Are you going to return to the present? Do we have any hints?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's a deep past or whether it's the future, and it might be both.
Fabulous. We're time travelling with Heather Rose. Who knows? We will wait with bated breath. And just before we go, I have to ask you, the podcast is Sundoku, so what books do you have piled up beside your bed that you might be reading or hoping to read that you might like to tell us about?
Well, right now I'm very close to the end of the magnificent Always Home, Always Homesick by Hannah Kent. It is a truly remarkable memoir, and I urge all writers to read it. I love, at the moment, I'm loving Is a River Alive by Robert Macfarlane. I've been away on the road for about 4 weeks, so it's been tricky to be away from my books, but there are a number, Hyperion, there's a number of science fiction novels I now have to get through again to remind myself how people do that. And then there's some ancient work. I bought a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, to really get my head around that one again to write this next book. So it's very diverse, and there's always poetry
I would expect nothing less of you, Heather Rose. Thank you. A Great Act of Love is a book and a story that I genuinely did not want to end, and thank you for it.
Thank you, Michaela. Thanks so much.
So Heather Rose, she's such a beautiful woman inside and out, and it was really pleasurable to sip tea and have a chat with her.
You're listening to Sundaku, the podcast for people who know one book is never enough. And now to talk about publishing. Emily Riches runs a brave, independent little publishing outfit, which recently published its first book. They also run a literary journal. I asked Emily what made her be so brave.
Well, our origin story is sort of as a COVID lockdown project. It was 2020 and I had lost my part-time job due to the lockdown. And it was a time when I saw a lot of other creative projects sort of popping up online on Instagram, and it seemed like a good way to stay connected to people and do something creative. That was sort of the beginning of Aniko Press, but I think I'd been working up to that for quite a while. I'd always loved writing. I always loved literary magazines. And so I did an editing and publishing course at UTS, and then started freelance editing. And I was really hoping to sort of like transition my career. And then, COVID happened. And then I just thought, why don't I just do it myself?
It sounds easy, but it's not that easy, is it?
No, it wasn't that easy. It was a big learning curve. But yeah, I started quite small with the Instagram page and the website, and just sort of learning how to build those. And then I put a call out for our first literary magazine, and the call out was themed Unsung, and it was focused on just sort of what was in the ether at the time, untold stories, emerging voices. And so that was sort of the beginnings of our first issue.
And what kind of contributions did you get when you called out with that kind of theme going?
All sorts of contributions. I think people were really hungry to find an outlet for their creative writing. I think maybe at the time there weren't so many places to be submitting writing, but yeah, I opened it to just international submissions. So we had a submission from Nigeria, we had submissions mostly from Australia, but the odd one from overseas. I remember there was a creative nonfiction piece by Charlene Alsop, which was really interesting, about how she discovered how her grandfather or great-grandfather, who was an Aboriginal man, fought in World War I, and she just sort of discovered this, and her family sort of discovered this, and the story was about her realizing this, and it became, I think it's the first place that she was published, but it was at the time they realized that at the time Aboriginal people couldn't serve. It was this real tension in her family history and in our national story, and that was such a interesting story, especially for the theme. And then that became the genesis, or that was part of her writing her first book, which was published by Ultimo Press a few years later.
Wow, so you've birthed an author there.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I can't take too much credit for it, but it was the whole point was to meet writers and engage with their work. And I think in the back of my mind, I always knew that I wanted to publish books. And so with the literary magazine, it was a great way to meet a lot of different writers, and that's how I met Miriam, actually. She submitted to issue 2 of the literary magazine, and then now we've published her debut collection, The Flip.
So going now from your literary journal, which is still continuing, very attractive presentation, by the way, I loved it online, you're now moving to actually being a publisher, which is a big thing, but I've noticed quite a few interesting independent publishers popping up. What is it? What's going on? Why is it such a good time to do such a thing?
That's a really good question. There have been quite a lot of new publishers popping up this year. Maybe there's just something in the water. I think, a lot of indie publishers got swallowed up by larger international publishers this year. And then there was the closure of Meanjin. So I don't know, maybe it's just part of the publishing ecosystem that these new publishers are popping up as larger ones sort of fall or get absorbed.
What about the cost of doing it, though? Is there something that's made it easier and cheaper to produce books?
For me, not really. I'm funding all of Aniko Press out of pocket. So we did get a grant for issue 2 or 3 of the magazine from Create New South Wales. But I think indie publishers really have to sort of scramble to find the funding in all sorts of different ways.
You must read a lot of interesting submissions. Do you see themes, current themes, preoccupations amongst young or emerging or first-time authors? What do you notice in terms of trends in what people are writing about?
That's interesting. Well, we haven't done a call out for the magazine for quite a while because we've been working on the book. And I say we, it's mostly me. And then we also have our book reviewer, Elaine, who writes for the website, and, people who pop in now and then to help out. But it would depend on the call out. I would usually theme them. So a lot of the stories or poetry would be geared towards the theme.
I was wondering if things like dystopian futures or AI or, the things that preoccupy people these days have crept into the literature that you're seeing.
I wonder, I'm not sure, but it's definitely in the reading, like just what people are reading at the moment. Like there is a lot of dystopian fiction and a lot of maybe otherworldly preoccupations, but we haven't yet opened for submissions for books. So yes, I'm sure I'll be very interested to see what kinds of submissions we get when we do open, because we're looking for literary fiction, short story collections, and I might lean towards a bit of creative nonfiction. That's a pretty wily beast. So, but yes, I will be really interested to see what kinds of books people are writing and submitting.
And what about your own writing?
Oh, I have not been writing for quite a while because I've been working on this project, but I would love to write some more. I was working on my, semi-autobiographical debut novel for a while there, as a lot of people are. So it would be nice to find a bit more time to work on my own writing. But yes, at the moment we're just doing a lot of promotional work for the slip, and which has been really exciting and sort of generative in its own way.
The other thing that you say that you want to do is bring together passionate writers and curious readers. I really like that sort of idea. Is there a particular kind of genre that you're after? Do you offer a framework or a definition of what you want, or is it up to the person who's writing and sending it in?
I suppose it is up to them. I think I really love reading work that I haven't seen before. So people with a really original voice or original perspective on an issue or a topic, work that's exciting and sometimes experimental. I quite lean towards, like in Miriam's collection, there's a few quite realist stories, there's a few with a slightly surreal bent to them, and then there's one that's like very experimental in form and voice. And I really like that mix. I like writers that aren't afraid to push the boundaries in terms of genre or form. So I find that quite exciting.
We spoke to Miriam recently, as you know, and I was pretty impressed with her writing as well. What was it like when you first looked at what she had sent? You must have stood out for you.
Yeah, it did. It really did. So she submitted to issue 2 and issue 3 of the magazine. And I was just so struck by her imaginative capacity and how mature and assured her writing was. It just felt very original, and she has such a great power of observation of how people think and how people act. Very psychologically and emotionally astute. And I think that really stood out to me. I think her writing also reminded me of a lot of writers that I really like. And it turns out once we started working together that we do share a lot of the same favorite books and favorite authors. So
Okay, so who are they?
so we both love Laurie Moore, Anne Enright, Claire Keegan, like women writers who are writing maybe slightly more experimental work in some ways, who are maybe a bit dark and funny and have that real acuity with human nature.
Emily Riches, she runs Aniko Press. They run regular literary competitions if you fancy giving it a go. So we'll put details in our show notes.
You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for people who take pride in the piles of books beside their bed.
And we'd love to know what you're reading. Send us a recorded review. You can write us a review. We'll read it out for you. Or just tell us what you love reading at the moment.
This podcast is all about great book recommendations, and we love to explore all sorts of books, whether they're old or they're new. There's a new episode coming out every 2 weeks, so when you're ready, send us your picks. And if you're a fan, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Happy reading. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell,
Kath Keneally,
Sarah Martin,
and me, Michaela Andreev. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundoku Cast. That's TSUNDOKU Cast.